Hello everyone, welcome to the Exploring Machine Intelligence class, where we study about deep learning for artists and various uses for creative AI. And this week's topic is the continuation of generative models from our previous classes. We will add some topics about these three particular machine learning techniques. That is a domain-to-domain image transformation called pix-to-pix, then the method called style transfer, and then a method called deep dream. We mentioned all of these in the first sessions or first classes, but we will go in a little bit more detail about them today. So this is today's schedule. Following the discussion that I had with you last week, there were some calls for having this class a little bit more practically focused. So I decided to have this week's session focus mostly on the usage of a progressively growing gun, which is something that we will be doing when we have the live session. But at the same time, you wanted to look at some other techniques as well, even if it's in a less depth of explaining every terminology there and all the theory there, but sort of just giving an overview of the additional methods that we can use. And so that will follow these basically three types of techniques and sort of like neural network model architectures that we can use. The first one is the pix-to-pix, then the style transfer, and then deep dream. Okay, so let's start about the concept that is behind a domain-to-domain transfer. So we have seen some models which were working with with images on inputs and also on the outputs. So for example, the autoencoder model, which looked similarly like this, where we had an image encoded into some intermediate representation and then reconstructed the original image. So there is nothing really stopping us from adapting this architecture for images that would come from two domains of data. So imagine if you have paired images, sort of images that you want on the input and images that you want on the output. You could use a model similar to this to sort of learn that relation. Okay, so there is a small difference from the autoencoder model, and that is the usage of the UNet architecture. And this is a sort of predecessor of that idea of a domain-to-domain transfer. So the UNet paper is something which has been, or the UNet model is something that has been brought up from the medical research field, and they were able to train sort of some model to analyze some input data and maybe perform some sort of analysis, like recognizing some shapes inside that original image, or a semantic segmentation, which was basically finding some areas in the original image and then analyzing or classifying them into various categories. So the model is similar to the idea of the autoencoder, where we are sort of parsing a input image, reducing the dimensionality with convolutions and downpooling or downsampling layers, and then sort of reconstructing that image back, and then getting an image at the output. There are two differences, both quite important. One is that the images on the prediction side come from a different domain, so we are no longer just reconstructing the same image, because that sort of corresponds to the domain-to-domain goal of this task. And the other, and also really important difference between an autoencoder and UNet model, or these types of model, is that there is a connection from sort of each resolution that we have inside the model there is a connection between the encoding and the decoding side. So there is a connection which is just copying all the input material on the output, and also at the same time downscaling and then allowing these sort of skip connections to appear through the network. And so actually for like a architecture similar to autoencoder, it would be really easy for the model to cheat, because it would just copy everything here and then ignore everything here, just set zeros there, and nothing would be learned, but nothing would be sort of problematic there, because we would be just simply reconstructing the image perfectly. But with the fact that in this case we are sort of learning the relation between two domains, so that these two types of images come from different backgrounds, it's no longer the same image which is reconstructed, but it's a sort of relation that we want to train this model on. So that's the difference. So the unit model is really good when working with even relatively few data, which is quite interesting. I think this is due to the fact that there is this skip connection, which sort of preserves a lot of the information in the image, and it sort of it learns where to focus the computing on. So if there is some translation that should happen on this resolution, it's probably will be learned with these layers. Whereas if there is something that should happen on like more high level conceptual level, that would happen somewhere down in the model. Okay, so yeah, from practical use, it's an interesting model to sort of look at. There is even the paper about this, the UNet paper is quite interesting to read. This is the paper which represents this one particular task, where they were trying to train a UNet model for a lunar crater identification. So even though the model was started in like medical applications, it can be used in other areas as well. However, we mostly care about this as a sort of only in the concept, because this is a predecessor for what we will see in the next slides. So this model, the first one that we want to sort of focus on today, is the pix-to-pix architecture, and that one poses a sort of the tasks that we want to train on or learn as a image-to-image translation. So this is just the first sentence from the paper, somewhere from the intro, I think, which says many problems in image processing, computer graphics, and computer vision can be posed as translating an input image into a corresponding output image. And so this is quite interesting, the concept of translation. So we sort of can consider the data that comes to be from two sort of domains. So we are translating between these two domains without specifically defining any rules. So we no longer have to sort of fill in the blanks and really hard code all the rules for this translation. We can sort of leave it on the model to fill in this or to learn this translation, or to learn this relation on its own from data. Which is really the strength of machine learning approaches. The one caveat for this is that this architecture needs a dataset of paired samples or paired examples. So somewhere on the input there will be these pairs. So image from the first domain on one side, and then image from the corresponding image from the other domain. So and this data set is then built from n samples. So we have to have for all the samples we have to have correspondences between the data. And sort of how to imagine that is by looking at these images. So these could be sort of representatives of these of those data sets, right? So we have some image on the left side and then image on the right side, and we sort of want this general purpose model, which should be able to train on any sort of image-to-image translation, to learn this one particular translation. So either from like semantic labels, so these are sort of the violet represents road, the blue represents some sky, whatever, right? We wanted to be able to predict, translate this into the real images domain, or something similar, just in houses, or something as a timed images captured from some cameras, where probably we can sort of say that these two images correspond enough together that we want these images from the first domain, called, I don't know, maybe images of day scenes, to be translated into images of night scenes. And so yeah, so these pairs which are shown here on the left, they are mostly coming from some other research, right? Where we probably captured this sequence, and then with a lot of labor, we had to sort of label everything in the dataset with these label images. And this comes from that research, but we can sort of reuse it in other domains as well. So we can use it with our image-to-image translation. Okay, so potentially this is a really powerful model if we say that we can learn any translation between two domains if we only have pairs of data. That's potentially really powerful, right? Like you can convert day to night images, or the other way around. You can sort of hallucinate in details from just labels, right? So in theory, if you created a new image with just drawn out cars with these categories, you could generate the corresponding reality to that, in theory. So we should sort of know that at some moment maybe we do need to have a lot of data which will be used to train this model, but at the same time also just like keep in mind that maybe the model will be filling in things which maybe will make no sense for us as humans. But still, this is pretty cool. So how does the pix-to-pix model relate to the unit architecture I was mentioning before? Well, if you want to read the paper, there are many more details. The basic architecture of pix-to-pix is sort of like this, where we have a gun-like architecture, where we have a generator, which is not just generating images from noise, but it's generating images from other images. So it's image-to-image translation, right? So that happens with the generator side, and then the discriminator side uses a regular discriminator, which would be recognizing between generated and real samples. Well, so it's a sort of hybrid between ideas from GANs and then ideas from UNet, which is really interesting that this works then with these types of data as well. So let's see. Oh yeah, just by the way, there is even an unpaired version where you can see that the limitation here is that you have to have a dataset where you are collecting images from one domain and then images from another domain. But it's not enough. You also need to have these images paired, so sort of have corresponding images. And famously, if you wanted to learn the translation between sort of maybe horses and zebras for this type of domain, or for this type of task, you would have to make every sample from one dataset and the other dataset appear really the same on the photo that you're taking in order to make that dataset to learn the translation, which is hard to do with zebras and horses because they will not be cooperating probably with this task, even though this task is a sort of just imagined problem. So for that, there is a paper called CycleGAN, which works with an unpaired data. So we have just a bunch of images from one domain and then a bunch of images from other domain, and then we sort of don't need to pair them. So if you're interested in that, search about CycleGANs. Okay, so what can we do with a general purpose image-to-image translation? So this can be used in various types of examples. The original paper was sort of already including some uses that the community created. So from these sort of demo examples, they were mentioning also some samples that people just trained on their own data. And so something, I guess the one type is represented by these: the edges to cats, sketch to Pokemon, and sketch to portrait, and possibly even the photo generator. These are interesting in a way that they trained it on paired data, which had cats on one side and then sketches of those cats on the other side. And the same way with like Pokemon images, and then the same with like portraits. Why this is potentially powerful is that it's relatively easy to convert a real image into a edges representation. So you could start with a full dataset of regular images, then convert everything to their representation of like edged, of just looking at the edges, and then train this relation, and then sort of reconstruct new samples which were never in the dataset. So yeah, basically this bread cat was never present in the real data, right? But because it was trained on sketches of real cats into real cats, it is now able to sort of to use that learned domain-to-domain transfer function and to use, sort of process even new images with it. Okay, so something similar happens with the in here, where it's sort of coloring in images, or with this example by Mario Klingerman, where you could also create these sketched sort of facial features automatically from images, and then sort of just learn this translation on the sort of in the other way around. And so the same sort of applies in like a puppet-like models, or some more useful tasks like background removal and stuff like this. Okay, so I think the real power here comes from the fact that even though this is a model which is sort of requiring paired data, we can sort of bring these some tricks to sort of have a image to sketches sort of conversion, and then sort of invert that conversion by using this algorithm. So one side of this equation, so real images to sketches, is easy, but the other one is sort of infinitely hard without this model and without the data. So this is an interesting sort of way, because you're sort of flipping that task that you had originally. Okay. So for resources, we looked at this with page before as well. It's a online demo of these image-to-image translation models. So basically, you can change any of these sort of images on the input, and then process them with pix-to-pix to create the resulting image. So that's the sort of online demo for this. There are many types of this model. So the basic pix-to-pix model, if you want to read a little bit more, there is the paper for it. There is a sort of more higher resolution version of that model, which is called pix-to-pix HD. I think this one was working with 256 by 256 pixel images, and this one is up to like 1024 by 2048 probably with resolution of images. So you can check that one. Or the sort of following work, which is trying to be able to translate from image to image, however, also include some sort of frame consistency if you are doing this with a video. So let's look at their demos here when they load. So this is the concept behind is very similar. We are converting images from one domain to another domain, and maybe then going back from that domain to something else, still using some intermediate representation like edges, or like this visualization of a pose, and then filling in the details. But now it's also working with with interframe consistency. So it's there are no sort of flickering effects when you are going from one frame to another. So okay, that's a really cool one. If you want to start using pix-to-pix, there is a demo of the pix-to-pix implementation in Keras on our website. So let's open that one up. If it will load. yeah, it's a huge file because I also included some results in there. Okay, or let's jump into the notebook as opened on on Google Colab. So this is a implementation that has been used from somewhere else as well, and I sort of placed in some codes from from other sources to sort of plug everything in and then test it on the current version of TensorFlow and everything that's running on Colab, which basically resulted in this one line. One sort of note about this model is that in comparison with the methods that we talked about in our last classes, so generative, adversarial networks, and maybe autoencoders as well, this one is relatively needs much less data than the previous models. So whereas something like a GAN, especially the super high resolution version of this, needs like thousands of images, ideally up to 30,000 images. This model can start with something reasonable even after just like 400 paired images in some relatively low resolution. So if you are interested about this, you can check this sort of iPouten notebook. Everything is just to be sort of run and shown, just to sort of see if everything is running. And the advantage is that you can also train everything in Colab, and it will take some time, but everything is sort of doable until yeah, in a Google Colab live session. So we wouldn't sort of run out of memory or run out of time. And we will see in our practical session that this is not true for other types of models. So yeah, so let's see. These are some results for a model that has been training there on this dataset. So it's sort of semantic labels into buildings translation, and so the first row is always the semantic labels. The second row would be the truth the true data, and then the third row is always some generated image. And so while it's not perfect, we can say that it still learns some usable relation. So we can sort of, if we changed this image, we could generate something which would be relatively realistic. And this is something that has been running for maybe an hour to train, and then we can just use that model. So it's yeah, and using just 400 images or something on the input. Okay, so there are some demos on uploading your own images or generating some noise and trying to see what the model will generate from that, or uploading in your own images and then seeing if that generated image will be something represented as a wall-like domain, which maybe will work, maybe will not, depends on the dataset as well. So this is mostly a easy to run demo, which is on our sites as well. So let's continue to the second technique that we will talk about today, and that is the style transfer method. So even in our initial classes about convolutional networks, we saw how deep convolutional networks separate sort of high-level and low-level information inside the network itself. So this was due to the convolution pooling combo, which we talked about in the third week, where each convolutional layer sort of serves as a image filter, and at different resolutions, what this image filter represents is sort of separated. So somewhere with the we can sort of talk about some of these layers as including more high-level information, so some sort of contents of the whole image. And so this is something that would happen somewhere at the end of a classification network. So this goes all the way back to something like ImageNet that we read about, or some other methods or some other architectures with similar task of just classifying data. So AlexNet, VGG, GoogleNet, all of those. And so the idea is that we can sort of represent some or talk about image content if we encode an image and extract the information that occurs in the deeper layers of that network. And on the other side, we can sort of talk about low-level information, sort of details or some sort of information about texture or about images which are sort of containing maybe edges information, and talk about that on the side of image style. So we can use this intuition which comes out from the convolutional layers and sort of take one image and encode it to receive its content information, and then perhaps take another image and then extract the style information from that. And the idea of style transfer is sort of revolving around the fact that we can then take these representations of content and representations of styles and start mixing them together somehow. And we will see in more detail how that happens. Yeah, so there is some similarity to perhaps some similarity to how if you convert music to spectrogram representation, in some lower frequencies you would get sort of main average information about the sound. However, somewhere in high frequencies you would get the crisp details and the additional information. So with this analogy, I know it's not one-to-one, sort of, so it's not working perfectly, but the style would be sort of detailed information, while content would be the sort of average information that you can take from the image. Okay, so what does this mean? We can sort of see it on this terrifyingly looking graph from the original paper, and then explain different parts. And sort of we don't have to really care about what these really mean, all the points there or all the losses that they are counting, but we can keep in mind the concept from the previous slide and then sort of try seeing it here. So this is a image that we want to extract the content from it. So we take the image, we let it be represented by a learned classification network. So if you remember our attempts to like extract feature representation from images somewhere in the practical session of third week, we were then looking at this latent space and then trying to see some similarities between two encoded images. So it turns out that if you encode an image and then extract some representation from the convolutional layers somewhere in the relatively deep in the network, this representation will sort of contain all information needed to reconstruct the contents of this image. So we can say that if we encode a image into a, let's say, VGG network and then extract the representation at some relatively high depth, so somewhere in the fourth convolutional block in 1, 2, 3, 4, one of them, let's say, we can talk about this being the image content or the content representation of an image. Okay. On the other hand, if we take another image, which we will call the style image, and then push that through the same network, we can start extracting sort of information about this image at various depths, and then maybe even look at all of those representations possibly from the start of the network, so somewhere where the network learns the sort of edges or texture information or something like that. And so if we isolate that information from this side, we can sort of talk about this being the feature representation responsible for style of that image. And so what we did here was basically just using the same architecture of a model which has been pre-trained on something like ImageNet, and then pushing through one image to extract its content representation at one hand, and then pushing through another image to extract its style information on the other hand. And now we can sort of we would like to combine these two information together somehow in a new image, which would hopefully be a mixture of content from one image and then style from the other image. And so this is done by starting with a random noise here, and while this finally will be some sort of training. All of this was done just to sort of pre-cook the some representations that we will be working with later. So finally here we can sort of start training, and what that means is start with a very rubbish image in the beginning, some noise, and then iteration after iteration try change it small bit by bit in a way that it should sort of fulfill two roles. When encoded with the same network, we are trying to have this newly generated image to be similar with the content feature representation. So somewhere in the very large depth, we are sort of matching it with the content, and then sort of everywhere else, or even maybe including this layer as well, we are sort of trying to match it with the style of the image. And so there are multiple ways of how to sort of represent this optimization technique, but thankfully we can use the gradient descent algorithm here as well, and so that's something that we can sort of plug in with all the other networks. And so I think they even named it or like phrased it as a problem that you can use the same solver to sort of change this image over time. And so what happens is that we, from a randomly generated image, iteration after iteration, we are sort of making it more and more similar to the content, or we are trying to, when encoded, we are trying to have the image fire the same type of things when it's as its content image, and then also fire the same type of features in the whole network, which would correspond to the style image. And so it's maybe a little bit difficult to imagine what would happen. And one thing to note also is that this is relatively slow. So we are sort of starting with a random image, and then iteration after iteration, we are changing it to sort of look more and more as these two images, with this one in content and with this one in style. Okay, and so as I was explaining that this is sort of a iterative algorithm, we can maybe look at those iterations of this algorithm and then see how some input image is slowly turning to sort of fulfill those two tasks that we gave it. So in this previous slide, there was a random noise here, but there are of course different types of sort of approaches to this, and so you don't have to really start with a random noise. You can also just start with the original image being here, and then this task would be maybe easier. And so this is what happened here. Iteration after iteration, you can sort of see that this image is being sort of propagated or changed in order to fulfill some type of error. And so the types of errors are two. One is to maintain the same content, or to have the same content as the original image in the content side, and then also to fulfill all of these rules sort of on the style side. So the loss could be compared something like this, where we are balancing between some content loss and some style loss. Okay, well, so how can we sort of imagine that this would look with some other example images? Is something like this. So I think we maybe the style transfer method is relatively known. So I think these models are or these images are something that you have already seen. So being able to sort of take in some input image and then use a style of some other images to sort of change to mix them in together. So these are some examples. We can also look at the DeepArt.io, which is a website which does this more or less for free online and relatively fast. So as I was saying, we in the previous or the original version of this network, it was sort of optimizing the image iteration by iteration. But since then, there were some additional papers which made it faster, and different approaches to this. So they ended up with a algorithm which is fast enough that they can just use a or have it run on a website. So all of these are sort of representations of what can happen with style transfer. You always have style on one side, and then the content on one side, and then the style image on the other side, and then you can sort of see these paired. So I think you can even like upload your own images. So if you wanted something with a style, you could either use some existing ones or some popular styles, and then sort of upload your own style and upload your own image, and then sort of create your own mixed images of these two. And so there is people are using this for a long time. I have known this website for a few years already, so I think this is quite easy way how to generate or how to demo this method. Okay. Yeah, this is a relatively famous version of a because it's working quite well, and I guess it's not such a hard task for the algorithm to learn. So yeah, and we're gonna go endless with this, exploring these websites. So yeah, if you are more interested on in sort of playing around with this method, I will refer to two notebooks which are or Colab notebooks, which are in this moment not on our own Git repo, but they are on the ArtML repository, which was used with the ArtML class at Carnegie Mellon, and they are also sort of sourced from all over the internet. So the basic version of the style transfer, where we sort of start with two images and then slowly change the generated image to kind of correspond to two styles, or to the style of one image and to the content of the other image, is represented here. And the faster method, which uses which can do style transfer in real time, is here. The only limitation here is, I think, that you have to use pre-trained styles. But I think there are some additional papers which allow you to just use arbitrary two images anyway, and also have fast evaluation of this. So if you would be more interested about that, you can sort of read about fast style transfer in these papers, and then also look around, and you could see some additional works. You can also notice that this is relatively old when it comes, or like 5 years old, which is relatively old when it comes to talking about state-of-the-art sort of machine learning approaches. So yeah. Okay, so that would be about style transfer. The last technique that we will mention today is the deep dream method. And this was a method which was originally used to just visualize some, or as a method to sort of visualize features that a network has trained on or has learned. And similarly as the style transfer, it works on a principle of image optimization. So you start with an image, and then you are changing that image rather than a network to sort of optimize it, to change its what the content of that image. Okay, so similarly, like in the previous case, we will be using a pre-trained convolutional network. So let's say that this is a network very similar to the AlexNet, maybe a few generations after that. So it's deeper and a bit more, has a little bit better representations learned. This one is called GoogleNet, but the principle is basically the same. We have pre-trained it on ImageNet, and sort of the original purpose of this network was to classify images into some 1,000 categories of ImageNet. Okay, as we sort of really just like discussed in the third week's class as well, the different layers of this convolutional network will sort of represent the different types of information. So the first one will sort of fire on edges, the second sort of layers, or as you go deeper and deeper, you would be increasing in the size of what the convolutional kernels are representing. So this again is sort of visualization. This is not exactly what the kernel would be encoding. Okay, so we can use a network like this with some original input, original image on the input. So let's describe the deep dream algorithm. We start with some original image on the input and then select some features somewhere inside this network. So let's say that we wanted to select the docs neuron, which is somewhere in the architecture, and then use that as a guidance. Okay, so we selected this feature, and then we will optimize over this input image. So basically, change that original input image in order that this feature here inside that network is firing with higher and higher force activation number for that one particular neuron. So maybe you can already see that this is a sort of similar approach to what we were doing with style transfer. We also chose some sort of intermediate representation somewhere, or some targeted neuron somewhere in the architecture, and we were trying to make some increase their activation by some optimization over the original image, which I think that's a really interesting concept, because we are turning around the training process. Rather than using a bunch of images to train a network, we are using a network to, well, change a bunch of images, let's say. So when iterating over this, we will sort of look at the original image and change it bit by bit to activate that selected feature. And so if we selected a feature which sort of includes docs, or which is something that has been trained to identify docs, then this optimization will change this original image into sort of maximize the to maximize the shapes which are representative of docs. So this is the reason why this method was used as a visualization method, or as a visualization technique, because with this you could sort of extract the information that is somewhere inside your trained black box network and sort of visualize what sort of shapes is this network even firing on. So if you remember a little bit, I had a small speech about about the danger of training a network on some dataset, because if you train a network on a dataset with methods that even the new methods that may come in research, or as old methods as deep dreaming, people can sort of visualize what the network is firing on. So they can sort of extract some information from your network about the original dataset that this network was trained on. Yep. So, okay, let's see. This is a visualization of this approach. So, as before, we can start with an existing image and optimize it to change it to maximize the activation on some selected feature, or we can again start with a random noise. So in this sort of visualization, we started with some random noise, chose one particular neuron inside the network, which I don't really know which this one network neuron was responsible for, but let's say this would be wires or something. And over the iteration of the deep dream algorithm, we sort of maximized the presence of those shapes inside the image. I think we can also look at this illustration. Okay. So we selected a bird neuron somewhere in the network, and it's sort of iteration by iteration changing the original image in order to get the content from that from that feature. So I don't know exactly which method they used here. This looks really high resolution when compared with the basic approaches here. So maybe it's some additional things that they added. However, as an illustration, it works relatively well. Okay, as a kind of additional example or a further illustration of what I was saying, that the contents of a learned trained neural network can somehow be revealed through this technique. There was a model released by Yahoo some time ago here to identify not safe for work content, and they did this without actually releasing the sensitive information dataset, right? But they did release the model itself. And so, of course, this was very soon followed by a deep dream-like technique. And I will not open this one here, but you can look it up. It's sort of revealing all of that, this principle. And not only that, I think it's quite a nice example there is that this deep dream technique can be sort of used to mix images through different genres. So they are using this network to generate sort of suggestive imagery of a landscape mixed in with some other types of shapes. So these were some safe for work examples. There is more there to sort of check that, but I don't think I can put that on screen, I guess. But yeah, it's still relatively safe for work, but as like a bonus information. Okay. So in comparison with the previous methods, I was not able to find a fully working online demo. So there is a website which presents some edits similar to Deep Dream, but I'm not 100% sure if it's not just a style transfer trained on Deep Dream-like effect. So if you want to explore a little bit more about Deep Dream, you can use some of these Google Colab notebooks. These are two particular ones which I think are relatively good. One is coming from the ML4A guide, which we also used similar guides from their website previously. And another one is coming from the ArcML repository. So these two should also allow you to sort of upload your own images and then run your own deep dream algorithms on them. And also sort of selecting your own favorite neuron inside the network. But that task is a little bit difficult because you don't know which network or which neuron corresponds to which style. So it's more or less guesswork sometimes at this moment. Okay. So if you want to read a little bit more about deep dreaming with in some publication which is newer than the method itself, I would recommend this blog post, which has all of those visualizations that I was showing a little bit before. Okay, so this mostly closes on the theoretical part of our class. And what we will continue with is the practical session where we will be talking about using progressively growing GAN. And I wanted to focus more on getting you all more or less ready to be able to use this method. So hopefully I will be able to go through all the practical steps needed. So something like data preprocessing at the start and then training the progressive growing GAN. There are some edits that are needed to sort of set up the network when compared with something that you would download from their own Git repo, but the edits are relatively easy when you know where to look. So I will sort of go through that with you. And yeah, really, in my experience, the progressive growing GAN is one of the best high resolution GANs out there these days if you want to train something on your own dataset. even the networks that sort of replaced it, or the following research by the same group, which produced StyleGAN and StyleGAN 2 as well. In my experience or my experiments, the newer networks don't work that well, or like lower on datasets which don't have that much information in them. So they are performing better with larger datasets, but not on like your own small artistic project that you would be working on. Okay, so one limitation here is that these do require some processing power, but I was able to run them on a 5 years old mid-end to high-end PC, which was sort of gaming PC before, and this is sort of now turned into a machine learning rig. So it is still doable on your own sort of equipment, relatively speaking. Okay, so we will focus on that in our practical session. For our next class, we will look into the next type of sort of generative algorithms, and that will be modeling sequential data. And you may also know that our next class will be probably our last content class, and following that we will have some exams, exam sessions. So in the next class, I will also include some information about how our exams will be. The main information that you should know even for today is that you shouldn't be really worried. It will be sort of mixed way of testing. There will be a lot of questions in some Moodle quiz, but don't worry about it. It will not be that difficult. Okay, if you want to read up a bit more about the various techniques that we talked about today, so in the end of every technique, I was sort of already mentioning some links, but there is a sort of summary of those. So the Distill article, which is really good about talking about feature visualization, some thought pieces about using neural networks as model for art, and also a guide for Pix2Pix, which is sort of explaining that more. And I think really Pix2Pix is really relatively nice and easy model to train on your own as well. So that's why I linked it here. Okay, so with that, we are ending today's class. We will focus more on some practical usage of a machine learning model of a real or high resolution GAN in the practical session. So that's also why today's theoretical session was slightly smaller. Nonetheless, I hope you liked it, and see you in the next practical session.